Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of Intuitive Angling. And man, I really appreciate you guys taking some time out of your day to spend with me and watch the video, because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite bass catching techniques, and that's fishing a crankbait in cold water cranking. And there's a lot to it, guys. It's a pretty complicated technique, and not technique, but in terms of bait selections and profiles in correlation with like water visibilities and water temperatures, there's a lot to it. So we got a really information packed video for you guys today. I think it's going to help you guys catch some fish over the next couple months. Also, guys, just a quick invitation. I'd like to invite everybody to please hit that subscribe button here at Intuitive Angling. That's a free and easy way to support the channel. Hitting that like button helps the channel. Sharing the videos helps the channel. And also, in preparation for spring, guys, please check out my Fish the Moment spring lake map breakdowns. I'll link them in the description here. Great resources to get some good fishing spots for coming up on this spring. So really appreciate that. Okay, one of the things I promised, guys, I'm going to really start focusing on trying to get out and do a little bit more on the water videos. I know I've been getting a lot of requests for that. A lot of people seem to like them, but it's been here in Missouri right now, man. Our lakes are frozen. It's hard to, the coves and creeks are froze over, so it's sort of hard to get in the water right now, but I will be doing that. Okay, cold water cranking, guys. This is one of my favorite ways to catch bass. It's sort of a specialty technique that I picked up slowly over the years by fishing tournaments all across the country, because we used to have a lot of tournaments in the early year, guys, like early in the year, like in February and March. And pre-spawn cranking, I had a chance to really learn a lot about it over decades and decades of fishing in a lot of different type of lakes across the country. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is the type of baits you want to use, how the fish react to those different type of crankbaits, retrieves, and type of areas that you want to fish them in. Now, I can tell you guys right off the bat right now, there's two categories of cold water crankbaits that you sort of have to focus on. And one are your wide wobbling crankbaits like the rock crawler, wiggle wart, maybe even a square bill crankbait if the water temperature is warm enough. And then your tight wobblers like that, you know, Megabass Sonic side, the Megabass flap slap, homemade, any type of a homemade flat-sided crankbait, Shad wrap. So when you think in terms of cold water crankbaits, think in terms of wide wobblers and tight wobblers, and that's what we're going to focus on in today's video. And also, guys, all in my tackle warehouse link in the description of this video, I'll link 5 or 6 of my favorite cold water crankbaits in there if you guys would like to pick some of those up. Okay, let's talk a little bit about tight wobblers and then wide wobblers. First of all, let's get into the wide wobblers, because in my opinion, the wide wobblers are a lot more situational. And like I said, in terms of wide wobblers, I'm talking about wiggle wart, rock crawler, that line of bait that has a pretty significant side-to-side wobble. Now, one of the things that you're going to find out about the wobblers, you know, wide wobblers versus tight wobblers in cold water cranking, it has a lot to do with your water temperature in correlation with your water clarity. You're going to find out, or it's been my experience, in other words, that the wide wobblers, you've got to have water temperatures around 50 degrees before them to be really effective. It's just sort of that thing about the mood and the personality and the aggressiveness of the bass, things that we don't really fully understand that trigger bass to strike. And guys, we don't want to understand it. One of the things, one of the reasons I dog live scope so much is, guys, never underestimate the importance of not knowing everything in fishing. You don't ever want to know everything. Then it just diminishes its value. But that's one of the things about cranking. We don't really know why the fish react like that, but they do. So when I'm fishing a wide wobbler, my wide wobbler selection is a wiggle wart, a rock crawler, and a square bill crankbait like that Megabass S crank. And my water clarity and water temperature determine that. So when that water temperature is between like 50 and 55 degrees, this is my prime wiggle wart, rock crawler water temperature. You can catch them a little bit in cooler water or warmer water, but guys, when you hit 50 to 55 degrees, perfect scenario for wide wobbling crankbaits. That's just the best time for them. And now once the water temperature hits 55 degrees, warms up a little bit more, your square bill crankbaits start coming into play. And a lot of this has to do with, as that water temperature gets to be about 55 degrees, those fish move up a little shallower and they move up tighter to the bank in shallower water, and that shallower running square bill crankbait, you know, targets those fish. So when that water's 50 to 55 degrees, I'm going to be focused on that water depth that's sort of 5 to 10 feet. And then, you know, 55 degrees over, the water's, I'm going to focus on that water depth 5 feet or less, in correlation with your water clarity. Now, the square bill crankbait, guys, you're going to have off-colored water for it. And that's another reason you have to wait till the water temperature gets 55 degrees. So perfect scenario for square bill crankbait fishing would be 55 to 60 degree water, and water visibility around, say, you know, anywhere between 1 to 2 foot is perfect scenario for that. That's going to put those fish shallow. Water's warm enough for them to be shallow, and they really react to that square bill crankbait. Now, the wide wobblers that go deeper, like the wiggle wart and the rock crawler, you can target those deeper fish with that, because if you fish those baits on a spinning rod or even a lighter line, you can get them down to 10 foot deep. And a lot of times when that water temperature is closer to 50, those fish are going to be backed out a little bit more, a little bit deeper. And with the rock crawler and the wiggle wart, they work better in a little bit cleaner water. So I like water visibilities of really over 3 feet for that lure category. 3 to 5 foot is like a perfect scenario for a rock crawler and wiggle wart. We'll talk a little bit about areas here in a second. Now, the tight wobblers, they are pretty much relegated, in my opinion, to when the water temperature is under like 50, 52 degrees. Perfect scenario for a tight wobbler is when the water temperature is in the upper 50s, upper 40s, close to 50 degrees, down to 45 degrees. So when I think in terms of like a homemade flat side crankbait, Megabass flap slap, Rapala Shad wrap, Megabass Sonic side, even a lipless crankbait, that is going to be when those water temperatures are sort of in that 45 to 50 degree range. So really pay close attention to that. Now, another thing about a tight wobbling crankbait is it doesn't really sound like it should be, but they work better in off-colored water. So I want my water clarity with a tight wobbling crankbait to be very similar to my water clarity with a square bill crankbait, just in cooler water. Now, one of the things about this is, like, when that water temperature gets 45 to 50 degrees towards the early spring and late winter time, even though the water is cold, let's say for example the water's 45, 47 degrees, but it's like late February and early March, those fish are still going to be shallow, because the water temperature is not going to be the thing that moves them shallow. It's going to be the increasing daylight hours. When you start to get towards the end of February, the first part of March, it can still be you can still have some really cold water, but our daylight hours are significantly longer than from January. And on a deeper biological, instinctual level, those fish start to move shallower in preparation for the spawn to feed up. So for whatever reason, guys, when you have water visibilities of like, say, 1.5 to 3 foot, and the water temperatures are in the 40s, mid to upper 40s, perfect scenario for a tight wobbling crankbait there. That's sort of the time frame that I look for that as far as my lure selection. Okay, let's talk a little bit about retrieve and areas that you want to fish it in. For the most part, a lot of people think, you know, cold water cranking, you need to work that crankbait super slow. I've never really seen that where you have to just work it like a snail's pace. Most of the time, I'm going to use some type of a slow medium stop and go retrieve. And the slow medium is just sort of like reeling the reel just about like this. Slow reel it 3 or 4 cranks and stop it, just about like that. And one of the important things when you're fishing crankbait in cold water, I don't care if it's a wide wobbler or a tight wobbler, you got to make it neutral buoyant. In other words, get you some suspend strips, those storm suspend strips, put them on the belly between the 2 hooks, and make sure that bait is weighted neutral or even sinking very slowly. Because what happens when you're trying to get that bait down deeper in that colder water and you're using a stop and go retrieve, you don't want that bait to get down there and start floating up when you stop the retrieve. You want it to stay right there because it keeps digging down. If your bait floats up on the stop and go retrieve when it's cold water, you're going to lose your depth on it. And you really need to get that depth for the most part, you know, regardless if you're fishing, you know, 5 feet or 8 or 9 feet. You want to maximize the depth of that bait. So that's a really important factor in that. Colors is another thing. The 2 different colors I use are shad patterns and crawdad patterns. For the most part, on the flat side crankbaits, I do like some type of a shad pattern. The only exception to that rule is I will use like a orange or red or some type of crawfish flat-sided crankbait if the water's really off-colored and the water's closer to 50 degrees. If you get water temperatures around 48, 50 degrees and you got water visibility about 1.5 feet, a lot of times they'll bite that crawdad pattern better than the shad pattern. But for the most part, when I'm cold water cranking with a tight wobbler, ideal scenario again, 2.5, 3 foot of visibility, some type of shad pattern crankbait. Another thing, guys, I'll tell you about a shad pattern. A shad pattern works better in the coldest water. If you're fishing that water temperature that's really cold, like in the mid 40s, the shad patterns always work better regardless of the sunlight conditions with that. Okay, now areas that you want to fish it in, a lot of this depends on the type of lake that you have as far as how your lake's set up. So we'll talk about some different options here, but you can't go wrong with channel banks on any lake that you fish. Channel banks are the #1 cold water cranking structure, and you're also going to find out that rock is the best cover for it. Sometimes you can catch them cranking over submergent grass beds, but that's a sort of a very limited situational experience for most anglers. But most lakes do have a lot of rock or gravel or clay in it. So try to concentrate on those channel areas where the water drops off pretty sharp, right off the bank. That's the best type of pre-spawn cranking area for sure. And all the time, I'm paralleling those banks, and the depth that I parallel the bank is dependent upon water temperature and water clarity. But paralleling those steeper channel banks, bluffs, even riprap bank is the best structures for it. I've caught a ton of good fish when it's cold on cold water cranking off of riprap, guys. Don't ever underestimate riprap. Even though it gets a lot of fishing pressure, you can catch some toads on riprap in the pre-spawn with those cold water crankbaits. But ideally, this is what I look for. If I'm cold water cranking, I want to find 2 or 3 of the biggest creek arms in the lake that I'm fishing, and I usually go back about halfway in those creek arms and I just start cranking those steep banks about halfway back in there. And that's the best way that I've ever caught them. Now, sometimes, guys, it's like if the water temperature gets closer to 50, maybe even in the low 50s, you can catch them on a little bit flatter stuff. Gravelly type banks leading into coves can be really good under that situations. Especially you can start using a lipless crankbait a little bit more at that time. But like I said, it depends on how the lake's set up and all the other variables surrounding it. But anyway, guys, that'll give you sort of something to get started with there with cold water cranking. Super fun way to catch them. The bites are usually pretty light. Remember that, guys, too. The bites in that cold water are not aggressive. A lot of times you'll just be reeling and it feels like just something like a leaf's on your bait or something. So you really got to be aware of the strike when it occurs there. So hope it helps you out. We'll talk later.